Hello, I'm Steve Buck, Chair of the Department of Psychology here at the University of Washington. The lecture you're about to see is part of our annual Alan Edwards Psychology Lecture Series. Professor Edwards was affiliated with the Department of Psychology for half a century until his death in 1994. He was an outstanding teacher, researcher, and writer who introduced new statistical techniques that are credited with changing the way modern psychological research is conducted. Alan also permanently enhanced the intellectual climate of UW Psychology by endowing the Alan Edwards Lectureship, which since 1999 has brought an impressive list of renowned psychologists to the UW campus to interact with faculty and students. Now, the annual Alan Edwards Psychology Lecture Series presents the excitement of psychological research and its tangible benefits to both local and national audiences. The lecture you're about to watch is one of a pair given back-to-back that matched a UW Psychology faculty member with a visiting researcher to talk about a topic of great public and scientific interest. Good evening. I'm Steve Buck, Chair of the Department of Psychology here at the University of Washington. I want to welcome you to this evening's continuation of the Alan Edwards Psychology Lecture Series. This series is presented by the College of Arts and Sciences and the University of Washington Alumni Association and funded by a generous endowment from Alan L. Edwards. The topics in this series illustrate how psychological research serves humanity. The University of Washington receives more research support money than any other public university in the nation. The Department of Psychology alone receives almost $10 million annually in research funding that helps us advance our knowledge of basic science, directly serves people in our community and around the globe, and helps train our undergraduate and graduate students. Tonight's lecture addresses symbolic understanding in infants and young children, challenges and benefits. Our first speaker is Dr. Judy DeLoache. Dr. DeLoache is the William R. Kenan Jr. Professor of Psychology at the University of Virginia. Her primary area of research is early cognitive development, especially the development of symbolic functioning. She's interested in how infants and very young children come to understand the nature and the use of a variety of symbolic objects, such as pictures, models, and replica toys. She's found that symbols that seem simple and obvious to adults are neither simple nor obvious to young children, and they create a variety of revealing errors in the process of figuring them out. Dr. DeLoache is co-editor of the recently published A World of Babies, a book on cultural differences in the treatment of infants. Among many other distinctions, Dr. DeLoache was recently elected as a fellow in the American Association for the Advancement of Science. She has served as president of the Developmental Division of the American Psychological Association and as a member of the executive boards of the International Society for the Study of Infancy and the Cognitive Development Society. She has a long history of funding for her research and currently holds a Merit Research Grant Award from the National Institutes of Health. She's also been recognized several times for outstanding undergraduate teaching. Please help me welcome Dr. Judy DeLoache.
Thank you, Steve, for that nice introduction. I'm very happy to be here at this, what seems to be a remarkable lecture series. It just sounds wonderful to me, what you're doing here. And I'm very happy to be a part of it. I'm also happy to be in this beautiful city. I haven't been to Seattle. I think I've only been here once before. And this morning when I was looking at the room of my hotel kind of blearily, I saw, oh, it's Mount Rainier in the distance. And there was only a couple of clouds in front of it, so I could actually see it. But it was quite a sight. So I'm very pleased to be here and to be talking with you all tonight. And I'm pleased to tell you about my research on how children become symbol-minded. Now, of course, nobody does a program of research on their own. And I just want to recognize some of the colleagues and students who have contributed to the research that I'm going to be talking with you about tonight. I also want to recognize the funding agencies without which we don't get to do much research at all. And I especially want to acknowledge the contribution of the parents of the children who participate in this research, because for developmental psychologists, if we don't have parents who are willing to bring their young children into our labs or let us come into their homes to observe their children, then we can't learn anything about development. So I just want to make that acknowledgement. Now, as Steve said, I'm going to be talking about how children become symbol-minded. And I think there's probably no other aspect of development that's more important than this particular one. As these philosophers Suzanne Langer said long ago, it's the power of using symbols that makes us, she actually said makes men, lords of the earth. But the point is that it's the symbolic capacity that is really one of the most powerful forms of cognition and communication for human beings. So it's a crucial aspect of development for children to learn to use the different kinds of symbol systems that the adults in their society use all the time to communicate. So this is, I think, an absolutely crucial part of development, and that's why I'm interested in studying it. Now, humans are, as Terry Deacon, another philosopher, said, the symbolic species. And here you see two young members of the symbolic species. The older boy here is just getting started on what's a very crucial form of symbol learning for children in the modern world. That is, he's starting to learn to read. And he's interacting with his younger brother, who is learning about another very important kind of symbol, that is pictures. Now, the symbolic species is not the only species that's capable of learning something about symbols. This is a picture of Panbanisha. And Panbanisha is a bonobo chimpanzee. And she's one of the chimpanzees who's been trained to use symbols to a truly remarkable degree. She has a remarkable degree of facility with using little kinds of symbolic representations to communicate with her caretakers. But impressive as her achievements are, they're not even as impressive as what this 4 or 5-year-old boy has already achieved, and she will never achieve the degree of facility with symbols that even a young child achieves. So symbolization is something that is not necessarily unique to humans, but it is something that's fundamentally a crucial aspect of what it means to be a human in the world. Now, since I'm going to be talking about symbols for my talk, I should give you my definition of what I mean by a symbol. There are lots of different definitions that people have used, but the one that I like is this one, and you can see it's a very vague definition that struck you right away, right? So a symbol is something that someone intends to stand for, something other than itself. So the vagueness here is quite intentional. So I want to emphasize the point that virtually anything can be a symbol for anything else, just so long as there's some human being who has the intention that that relation holds between those two entities. Okay? So it's a very loose definition, but I think it's crucial that it be exactly that loose. And the intentional part of this is crucial. So I think that what it means for something to be a symbol has to be based upon the human action of having an intention that one thing stands for something other than itself. Now, Miss USA, I think, provides a good illustration of this point. Now, I would argue that is not, in fact, a symbol on the side of Miss USA. It's a spot on the side of a Holstein cow. I grew up on a farm, so I know that's a Holstein cow. So that's not really a symbol because it was not intentionally created to stand for something. But notice that I could turn it into a symbol. All I have to do is point somewhere on there and say, this is just about where Charlottesville, the University of Virginia, is located. And I suddenly turn that into a symbol. You can all understand exactly what I'm doing. And we would all be using it as a symbol in that sense because we would be intending to use it that way, even though it wasn't created for that reason. Now, Miss USA has recently had some competition from Miss World. And I think Miss World actually helps to make my point, because I think we would all agree that somebody intentionally created this image to make whatever point they were making. Okay, so to go back to my definition, a symbol is something that someone intends to stand for something other than itself. So a symbol, of course, always represents something other than itself. And you would think that this would almost go without saying, and of course to a group of adults it does. That's the very essence of a symbol. But it turns out that this is actually a crucial point with respect to young children and the early development of symbol use, because it's exactly the understanding that a symbol differs from its referent, from what it stands for, and that is an understanding how a symbol differs from its referent that can be very challenging to very young children. And so that's what we're going to be focusing on tonight. Now, in the research that I do, one of the important concepts here is the dual nature of symbolic objects. So we're talking about real objects. We're talking about pictures, maps, models, all kinds of things that are both a real object but also a representation of something other than themselves. Okay? A representation of their referent, what they stand for. And this turns out to be part of the challenge for young children. Well, this turns out to be the significant challenge for young children, is appreciating that a given entity can be both a real thing in and of itself, but also that it can stand for something and tell you something about something other than itself. Now, this is something that artists have been fascinated with for a long time. And this is, I'm sure, an illustration that's familiar to many of you. This is René Magritte's famous depiction of a pipe, and the title underneath it says, "This is not a pipe." So he's playing with exactly this idea of the relation between a representation and its reference. So, of course, a picture of a pipe is not a pipe. But of course, it is a pipe in another sense. And this back and forth is part of what Magritte and many other artists have played with many times over. So because of the dual nature of symbolic artifacts, of symbols that are real objects, the child is presented with the problem of what I've called dual representation. In order to use a symbolic object, a child has, well, anybody has to do this, but for us it's not a challenge. But the child has to mentally represent both aspects of the dual reality of the symbolic object. So the child has to have a mental representation of the object itself. So take a picture. The child has to have a mental representation of the picture. But at the same time, there has to be some representation of the abstract relation between the picture and what it stands for. The abstract relation between the symbol and its referent. And this turns out to be the challenge for very young children in using a variety of symbolic objects, as you'll see. So what I'm going to do is tell you about 3 different kinds of problems that very young children have, infants and young children have, with dual representation. So I'm going to be talking about some studies that have to do with pictures, babies and pictures, some studies with scale models, and some studies that have to do with toys, with small replica objects. And in all of these cases, the story is that attention to the symbolic object itself, so the degree to which the child pays attention to and thinks about the object itself, makes it difficult for them, not impossible, but it makes it difficult for them to appreciate its relation to something other than itself. And part of the challenge of all of this, and this is something that will link the talk I'm giving to the talk you'll hear later from Dr. Carlson, is that part of the challenge is inhibiting, then, the response to the symbolic object itself. Inhibitory control, the ability to not do something, to pull yourself back from thinking about something or responding to something, is really a general problem in early childhood. That as children get older, they get better at. But it's a specific problem in early symbol use, as you'll see. Okay, so the first problem that we're going to talk about today has to do with babies' exploration of depicted objects. So what you see on this slide is an infant who, as you can see, is looking at a picture book. But notice that he's not just looking at the book the way that you or I would do if we had a picture book in front of us. He's actually got his hand on the page of the book. And what he's doing is, in fact, exploring the depicted object. He's manually exploring the picture on the page in front of him. Now, before I say anything more about this topic, I have to emphasize to you just something I want you to keep in mind, which is that infants can perceive pictures and they can discriminate between pictures and objects. So what I'm going to be telling you about has nothing to do with perception or discrimination. Babies are perfectly fine in terms of perceiving pictures, but that's not the same thing as understanding the nature of a picture or how they're used. And by the way, so can some other species. For example, should you ever happen to need to keep a sheep in a pen by itself, and you need to keep it quiet and calm, which apparently some people need to do, someone has discovered that all you have to do is put a picture of another sheep of the same type in the pen with the captive sheep, and it will calm them down. So that's very useful knowledge. So can a variety of other species, including this monkey on the right-hand side of the screen here. This monkey was a participant in research that was recently conducted showing that monkeys will learn to perform some particular behavior in order to get a reward of seeing a picture of another monkey. Okay? So they'll work in order to get to see a picture. Now that tells us they can perceive the picture. Now one detail I should provide for this story is that really what it was is that male monkeys would work very hard to get to see a slightly different view of a female monkey than the one that you see here. And this study very quickly became known as the pay-per-view. Okay, so I'm going to show you now what I'm talking about here. So this is actually the very first subject that was run in this particular study of infants' exploration of pictures. This was something that we actually thought would be very hard to study, and this is, again, the very first subject that we ever tested. What you see here is a 9-month-old baby, and in front of him on the high chair is a picture book that we specifically made, and the picture book has on one of the pages, it's got a very high-quality photograph that looks quite realistic of an object, and it's depicted small enough so that if it were a real object, the baby could actually pick it up. Okay? And the question is, how would the babies respond to these depicted objects? And so what you're going to see now is you're going to see 3 different babies on this film clip. So this child is, as you can see, manually exploring the depicted object. And he did this to every single picture in the book, every single one that came up. He just avidly and repeatedly tried to feel it, to pat it, to pick it up, etc. Here's another participant. Now this girl is very different from that boy. She's a very different style. She's actually more interested in the experimenter than she is in the pictures. Nevertheless, she too, at some point, reaches out and, not so enthusiastically as the boy, but nevertheless, just checks out the picture on the page. Here's a very laid-back guy. But again, he's doing the same thing. Every single baby in this study, at least once, reached out to the picture and manually explored it in some way. Now, we wondered, what does this have to do with babies' experience with pictures? And I can tell you the answer would appear to be nothing, because we had this unique opportunity. A friend of mine who's an anthropologist, was going off to Ivory Coast in West Africa to do research with families and infants in a Beng village, a very isolated village where there was very little exposure to pictures. So babies in this society would not have seen pictures at all. And so we were interested in what these babies would do if we presented them with picture books like the ones that you just saw. Now, what I first want to show you, though, is what the situation was like in this village. So this is our laboratory. There are people all around. There are adults. There are children. They're talking. They're laughing. They're telling jokes. There are chickens. There are goats. The book falls apart. The whole village is taking part in this. There were many challenges to this particular project. Nevertheless, here's a 9-month-old baby, like the babies you saw before. Here's the book. It's sort of obscured behind this thing, but you're going to be able to see exactly what happens when we put the book in front of this 9-month-old. And you see he's, if anything, even more avid to try to interact physically with the pictures than the American infants were. This is the anthropologist's son. He was our volunteer experimenter. And here's another little girl who's, otherwise engaged, but nevertheless, she reaches out and explores the pictures on the page. So in psychology research, and in any research, we teach our graduate students you have to maintain very, very strict control over the physical setting and everything about it. But notice that if you have absolutely no control whatsoever and you get the same result, then you can be fairly confident in knowing what's going on. So what we can say then is that babies explore depicted objects, treating them as if they were real objects. And the claim here is not that the babies truly believe it's a real object. The claim is they don't really know what it is. It looks like a real object in many ways. In other ways, it doesn't look like a real object. So they reach out and they explore it as a way of trying to figure out what's going on. But in the process of doing this, they're treating the symbol, the picture, as if it were its referent. So they're spontaneously confusing reality and representation. And babies are not the only ones who do this. This is a film clip that was sent to me by Thomas Persson from the Max Planck in Leipzig. And what you're going to see here is a gorilla baby behaving very much like the infants that you've just been seeing. So somebody's putting a pair of pictures in front of the baby, and he looks just like the human infants, trying to manually investigate the depicted object. Oh, by the way, our sheep friend, it turns out that that when you put the picture of the other sheep in the pen with the subject sheep to keep them calm, they go up and sniff at it and lick at it. So doing the same thing. Now, just to illustrate how strong this phenomenon can be, what you see here is a little 9-month-old baby, and the picture that's in front of him that you can see he's got his fingers on is a picture of a baby bottle, okay? A few frames later, and a few frames after this, he actually has his mouth down on the nipple of the bottle. So this is a very deep-seated confusion that these children have with respect to the nature of pictures. Now, you won't be surprised to know that the more realistic the picture is, the more babies are fooled into trying to manually investigate, trying to figure out what it is that they're seeing. So this slide just shows you that the greatest degree of this kind of manual exploration of pictures happens if you've got a really good color photograph. If you have a black and white photograph, you get less and less if you get down to just black and white line drawings. So the more the photograph looks like the more the picture looks like a real object, the more babies are confused by it and will actually try to manually explore it. Now, of course, babies stop doing this. They figure out at some point that pictures really do differ from objects. And so what you see here is on the left side, you see bars for 9, 15, and 19-month-old babies. And you can see that the 9-month-olds do quite a bit of this kind of manual exploration. But by the time they're 18, 19 months of age, they've essentially stopped doing it. What they're doing instead, so what they figured out here is they've learned that even though this thing looks like a real object, it's not. It's not a real object. There's no point in trying to mess with it. What they do instead is, instead of manually investigating it, they point. to the depicted object. And that's, of course, what we do. That's how adults and children interact with picture books. So what these children have learned is both what pictures are not, that is, they're not something that you can manually do anything with. You can't pick them up or get any pleasure out of actually exploring them. Instead, there's something to talk about and to point at and to interact with someone else about. So they've learned what pictures are about. So with respect to babies' manual exploration of pictures, I think the main problem here is that they simply don't know what pictures are. So this is a kind of symbol that they do encounter to some degree in the environment, but they have to learn the nature of pictures. They have to learn what a picture is, and they have to learn what a picture is not. So in this particular example, then I think the main thing that's going on here is learning about the nature of this particular kind of symbol. Well, let's turn to another domain that I've studied. You see this little boy looks very proud of himself, right? He's very proud because he has just found that stuffed dog that was hidden in the basket on the table beside him. And the way that he knew where to find the dog was that he had watched as an experimenter had hidden a miniature toy dog in a scale model, in a tiny little basket in a scale model of the room that he's now standing in. And so he understood that when he saw the tiny toy hidden in the model, and we told him we're going to hide the big toy in the same place in the room, he understood that. He went in and found the toy. So the symbolic retrieval task is this scale model task where the child watches while an adult hides a miniature toy somewhere in a scale model of a room. The room's right next door. The child then goes into the room where they're supposed to retrieve the bigger toy corresponding to the miniature toy that's hidden in the corresponding place in the room itself. Notice to do that, though, they have to understand something about the relation between the model and the room. Okay? So they have to understand something about the fact that the model stands for the room and that what happens in the model tells them something about what's going on in the room itself. Now, what I'm going to show you here is a film clip that very clearly illustrates what happens when you put a 2.5-year-old child in this scale model task.
Ready to play our game, Molly? I have someone to show you. This is Big Snoopy. And you see this room? This is Big Snoopy's room. And all of this is all of Big Snoopy's stuff.
At Judy DeLoache's lab at the University of Virginia, a researcher is introducing the game to Molly, age 2.5.
And that is Big Snoopy's pillow. And this is all his stuff. And you know what else? Big Snoopy has a best friend. His name is Little Snoopy. And Little Snoopy has a room, just like Big Snoopy's room, except it's little.
In the adjacent room, Molly sees a scale model identical to the real room.
This is Little Snoopy's room. This is Little Snoopy's table. You see how it looks just like Big Snoopy's room?
The researcher draws her attention to all the features of the miniature room, just as she did in the real room.
And Little Snoopy's pillow, just like Big Snoopy's. You see how they're all just the same? You know what we're going to do next, Molly? I'm going to hide Little Snoopy somewhere in his room, and then my friend Megan is going to hide Big Snoopy in the same place in his big room, and then you're going to go find him. You think you can find him? Little Snoopy is going to hide right under there. You see him under there? Yep.
Will Molly know that the toy pillow represents the real pillow in the big room?
Think you can find him? No, not under there.
Molly hasn't got a clue where to look for the toy.
So Molly was just like, 90-some% of the 2.5-year-olds that we've ever tested in that scale model test. She didn't have a clue where the toy was in the room. And notice all of the information we gave her. We told her everything that we were going to do. And she was quite happy to go in and look for the toy. She was enjoying the game. And we always, by the way, have the children find the toy. So at the end, they're always happy because they found the toy and they think, everything's great. Their parents, on the other hand, are shocked and astounded. We very, very quickly learned when we started doing this research to be sure and warn the parent of every 2.5-year-old who had brought their child, who they of course think is a genius, into our lab. We'd say, this age group, 2.5-year-olds never get it right. And then if their child fails, which as you can see, almost all the 2.5-year-olds simply don't know how to do this task, they don't feel so bad. And then of course if their child does do well, then they know it's a genius for sure. Anyway, what you see here is just this remarkable discrepancy between the 2.5-year-old children who really, really just don't get it, and 3-year-old children, almost all of whom find this to be so easy. They still find it to be fun, but they find it to be trivially simple. Because so there's this remarkable developmental change just between 2.5 and 3 years of age in children's understanding of the symbolic relation between the scale model and the event that happens in the model and the room and the unseen event that went on in the room. Now the problem here, I think, has to do again with dual representation. That to use the information in the model, you have to understand that the model stands for something other than itself. So the child, when they're watching the adult hide the toy in the scale model, they have to be thinking about the room. But the model is a really, really interesting, cool set of things. So it draws their attention. They're fascinated with it. They're paying attention to where the toy is hidden in the model. But when they go in the room, they don't transfer that information to the room. And by the way, I forgot to tell you something crucial. We do then bring the child back into the scale model to find the toy that they actually saw being hidden. They know where the toy is that they saw being hidden. Okay, so it's not a memory problem. So the child remembers where the toy is in the model. They just don't realize that that tells them anything about what went on in the room. So they don't get the symbolic relation between the model and the hiding event that went on there and what's going on in the room. So part of the trouble here is then what I've described is that kids have difficulty, the younger the child, the more difficulty they have inhibiting their response to the model as an object. The model itself is interesting, so they're interested in the details of the physical model, and they don't treat it as a symbol standing for something other than itself. Now, we've done a lot of studies basically testing that idea, testing the notion that dual representation is the challenge for very young children in this task. And I'm just going to tell you about my favorite one, where the idea here was, well, what if you could eliminate altogether the need for dual representation from the scale model task? If you could somehow eliminate the need for dual representation, then it should be easier for children to reason between the model and the room. Now, how could you do that? Well, what I'm going to show you here is another film clip of a child in a study that we called the Amazing Shrinking Room study. This was actually the suggestion of a colleague of mine who said, well, what if you could shrink the room to be the model? Then the room actually is the model. The model is the room. Therefore, there's no need for dual representation. Okay? If in the mind of the child, the model is the same thing as the room, they don't have to have a dual representation of the two. All they have to do is take what they learned about the model or about the room and apply it to the other space. Okay? So we're getting rid of the need to think about the model in two different ways at the same time. All the child has to do is believe what we tell them, which is that we have a shrinking machine.
This is my very special machine. This machine is a shrinking machine. It can shrink toys. Would you like to try that out? Yeah. Okay.
Alexis is the exact same age as Molly.
In front of the machine, and we'll turn it on. And let's go right outside and wait while the machine works.
When Alexis leaves the room, another researcher replaces the big doll with a miniature. In the next room, Alexis hears the noises of the so-called shrinking machine.
Are you ready to go see what happens to Terry? Let's go see what our machine did with Terry. Hey, the machine made Terry really small.
The device of the imaginary shrinking
that.
machine allows Alexis to hold only one image of a doll in her mind.
My machine can make Terry turn big again.
That one doll can grow smaller or bigger. But in her mind, it's the same doll.
Look at that. I think that the machine made Terry big again. That is so cool. You know what else? Come on in here. This is Terry's room. This
Just as Molly was,
Chair.
Alexis is introduced to a
and
room
this
with
over
all its
here.
furnishings.
This is Terry's drawers. And this is Terry's floor pillow. Terry is going to hide. And then we're going to make the room small, and you're going to come back and find him. What do you think? Terry is going to hide right under here. See him there? Here, take a look. You see him hiding there?
Will the shrinking machine help Alexis locate the doll by making her think there is
ready?
only one room and one doll?
Let's go. Okay.
Let's go see.
Are you ready? Okay, let's go. Remember that Terry's hiding in the same place as when the room was big.
Yeah.
Okay, go find him.
I think
Oh, look at that.
Alexis has no trouble finding the hidden doll in the miniature room.
Okay.
Only with
thank
Judy
you.
DeLoache.
They go on, of course, to say things that aren't true, but so this shows you what these 2.5-year-olds do in the standard model task and the shrinking room task. So the kids were just like the little girls that you saw here. So in the model task, they have no idea. But when you've gone through all of this nonsense about this shrinking machine, which notice, she believed it totally, right? They're all like that. They they completely believe what this adult is telling them, which has actually launched a whole new line of research in my lab about what children will believe when you tell them. And I'll tell you, it's kind of scary, actually, what we're finding out. But anyway, so the point of the study, of course, was to test the idea of dual representation. And so what this tells us then is that if the child doesn't have to understand the symbolic relation between a model and a room, if they think the model is the room after it's been shrunk, then it's just a memory task and they can do it. But when they have to keep in mind the relation between these two different entities, the symbolic relation, then it's overly challenging for children of this age. So here, with respect to children's ability to use scale models, the main problem here, I think, is a failure to achieve dual representation. And the fact that the shrinking room study works when you take away the need to achieve dual representation, I think is very strong evidence that that really is the major thing that's going on here. But at the same time, the development that occurs in this case, just between 2.5 and 3 years of age, is a function of many different factors. And I'm not going to talk about those factors right now. If you want to ask about them later, we can do that. But I want to go on now to the third domain that I want to talk about. And this is what my colleagues and I refer to as scale errors. This is something that young children do. This line of research, by the way, started purely because I and my colleagues had observed young children doing something very odd. So every so often, the kids who would come into the lab for the scale model studies, every so often, some little 2.5-year-old would try to sit on the chair in the model. The chair in the model is, that big, and they go and they try to sit and we grab the, my colleague David Utall's daughter had tried to crawl into the bed that her doll. And Carl Rosengren's daughter had tried to get into a car just like the car that you see this little boy trying to stick his foot into. And it looks like he's trying to get into the car, and that's in fact exactly what he's doing. So that's what a scale error is. And let me just show you an example of a scale error, and then I just want you to see one in action, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about it. You notice there's a slide, a miniature slide right here. And this little girl Just going to go over and get on that slide.
What's going?
You're going wee, wee.
Okay, that's a scale error. Now, here's how we define it. A scale error is something where the child makes a serious attempt to perform an action that's impossible due to extreme differences in the size of the entities involved. And one of the entities involved is, of course, the child, him or herself. But notice a serious attempt. So we're not talking about pretense. So all the examples I'm going to show you, if you think any of them are pretense, then you're not going to believe what I have to say about this phenomenon. But I don't think you'll think that. I think you'll agree with me that the children are seriously trying to interact with these objects. And I'm going to show you one more example of another scale error. This is another one with that same slide that you saw before.
On the slide. You're going to go wee down the slide.
Okay.
Wee down the slide.
Now, part of the reason that we say that this is not pretense is if you think of the two little girls that you saw, number one, they fell off of the slide in the process of doing it, right? So if you were pretending, you wouldn't actually sit down and fall off of it. And then this little girl was upset. Now, let me tell you, I don't think any other child has ever been as upset as she was. Usually, you know, things don't work for toddlers all the time. So usually when they do a scale error, they just go on and do something else. Sometimes they look slightly abashed, but that's about all. But anyway, so in this initial study, the goal was simply to document the existence of scale errors because nobody had ever talked about this phenomenon anywhere in the literature in developmental psychology or anywhere that I know of. So that was the goal. It was simply to document that scale errors occur. We picked the age range of 18 to 30 months, and as it turns out, that was a very good choice. And the strategy was we wanted to make it more likely that we could actually see scale errors in our lab with our camera going so we could get the film clips like the ones that you just saw. And so what we did is we brought children into the lab, and we had 3 large toys that they played with. So there was a big car that, you know, you've seen these toys all over the place. There's a big car they can get in. They can actually move it around the room. There's a child-sized Blue's Clues chair that they can sit in. And there's this indoor slide that they can climb up and go down. Now, these were actually spread out around a big room. And there's a lot of other stuff in the room as well as these toys. But so we make sure that the child actually interacts with each of those large toys a couple of times. Then the child leaves the room, and when they come back, the big ones have been replaced with these little miniatures. And we just observe. We just see what they do. And if they don't do anything spontaneously, we do give them prompts. So I'm going to show you some more clips, because basically these film clips are the data for this research. Kids make a lot of scale errors spontaneously. Sometimes they make them in response to our prompts. There doesn't seem to be any difference in the nature of them. So I'm going to show you 4 more clips, because again, you know, these basically are the data of this research. So right there is a little miniature chair.
And about the dog.
Okay, this is going to be another one with this same chair.
Okay, I'm ready to read a story with you.
Hello. Okay.
Which story should we read? This one?
Wait.
You want to read this one? Okay.
He finally notices it. Okay, 2 more. This is a little miniature car. Say in.
In, are you trying to get in?
In. In. In.
I see.
He's asking for the experimenter's help.
This.
And the last one, which is my, where's my thing? There's my and everybody else's favorite, is again with the car.
Yes. Uh-huh. I can't drive my feet.
You can't drive your feet?
I can't.
Do you fit?
I can't.
You can't?
I can't.
So she has a good plan.
If you take your shoe off, you can?
Being a developmental psychologist is actually a lot of fun. So the primary result of this research, which remember the main point of the research was simply to document, to establish the fact that children actually do make scale errors of this sort, was that children did make scale errors, as you've seen. And this slide, by the way, is a little boy who's making a completely spontaneous scale error. He just came in to be I was just getting photographs of the objects, and he spontaneously tried to sit in the chair. Now, the scale errors are relatively rare. So in the initial study, slightly fewer than half of the children ever made a scale error. The average, as you see, is slightly less than 1 per child. So these are really occasional errors. This is just something that a child now and then will do. They don't do them all the time. They don't do them super frequently. Or if children did them that frequently, somebody else would have noticed this a long time ago. But just every so often a child does it, and I think usually a parent or a grandparent looks at them and just says, oh, isn't that funny? You know, but you don't think much more about it. But, you know, I think it's actually a fairly interesting situation because it's another example of a dual representation problem where the child is confusing the symbolic object with its referent. Okay? And by the way, let me just point out that one of the things that this is not, is it's not due to a problem with body image, or at least that's not the main thing that's going on. It could be that the child doesn't understand the size of their own body. But in fact, they make scale errors with dolls. So they'll try to put a pretty big doll into a little tiny stroller, in the case here. They're not as huge a difference as the scale errors with the children's own bodies, but they do make similar kinds of things. But why do kids make scale errors? Why do young children make scale errors? Well, I think there are several factors that are involved. And one of the clues that we have to, one of the things that provides a clue is to look at the incidence of scale errors by age. So in that first study, we had children between 18 and 30 months of age. And if you look here, what you see is an inverted U-shaped curve, so that at around 2 years of age was the maximum for children were the most likely to make scale errors at that age. So this is the percent of children who ever made a scale error. The graph looks the same, by the way, if you just graph the number of scale errors. But the peak was at around 2 years of age, fewer younger children, fewer with older children. Now, what is going on here? Well, I think there's two different things going on. And it's never that satisfying to have two different causes for a single graph, but I think that we actually need one. So I think that scale errors increase between, say, 18 and 24 months of age with just the general increasing knowledge that young children have. So for a child to make a scale error, I think they have a very strong mental representation of the category of objects. So chairs, for example. You have to know a lot about chairs, or slides, or other kinds of objects that a child might make an error with. So I think that scale errors increase in part as children's knowledge representations of categories of objects grow increasingly richer. But scale errors decrease with a change in children's ability to inhibit an action that they are inclined to do. So throughout the early years, as I've mentioned earlier, children's ability to not do something that they have an impulse to do increases. They have an increase in inhibitory control. So I think that's what's going on then is as that really comes into play between 2 years and 2.5 years of age, so that this inverted U-shaped curve, then I think is the result of these two different factors, the growth of knowledge, but at the same time the growth in inhibitory control. So I think that's part of the story of what's going on with respect to scale errors, but it's certainly not the whole story. Now, an important clue to what I think is another piece of the puzzle, remember this little girl. You guys laughed when you saw her bending over, looking between her knees before she sat down in that chair. So notice that what she was doing was she was very, very carefully locating exactly where that chair was so that when she sat down, she could get herself right on top of it. Okay? And this little girl, remember, was trying to get into this car. And notice that what she's doing is she's holding on to the top of the car. She has opened the door of the car. And she's got her foot right up against the door to the car. So these children are doing these kind of nutty things of trying to interact with these tiny objects. But in the process, they're actually being very accurate in their motor behavior, in the movements that they're making in the process. So what I think is going on here is that we've got, again, two different factors. But these are going on at the same time. So I think that what we've got is that in deciding what they're going to do, okay, the child sees the miniature object. In deciding on an action plan, making a plan for what to do, I think the plan is based on the referent object, that is the larger toy. So when the child tries to go down the miniature slide, or when they decide to go down the miniature slide, they're really thinking of the bigger slide. And the size of the replica object is not taken into account. So they're not doing dual representation, they're just thinking of one thing. And in this case, I think what they're doing is they're thinking of the larger object when they form the plan of what they're going to do with the miniature object. Once they start to execute the plan, though, then they do take the size of the object into account. Okay? So the child who's decided she's going to sit in that little tiny chair that she can't possibly sit in is very, very carefully and very precisely using the size of the object to guide her actual physical movements with respect to the object. So what we have then is basically a dissociation in the use of visual information for planning versus controlling an action. So the children are not taking size into account in the formation of a plan. They form this goofy plan. Right? They're going to try to sit in a chair they can't possibly sit in, or try to get into a car that there's no way they could ever possibly get into. So they're not thinking of the size of the actual object in front of them. But once they try to execute this goofy plan, they are very precise in the execution or the attempted execution of the plan. And this analysis of scale errors actually fits well with some very prevalent theories of visual control of the use of vision to control perception and action, where the notion is that there are neurally and functionally distinct visual areas in the brain that have to do with action planning versus action control. And so I think that what we have in scale errors, in addition to the other things I've talked about, is probably just an immaturity in the brain function that is purely a reflection of the fact that these are very young brains that are involved in this activity, where where the information about size isn't integrated as readily as happens with older children and with adults. So I think here, what's going on then with respect to scale errors is that in large part, immaturity in cortical areas that are involved in the integration of visual information needs some further maturation to get kids to stop making these kinds of remarkable errors. So I've talked about three different problems that young kids have with dual representation. Some of the things that I think are common to these three different problems, they all, I think, do have to do with dual representation. That is a challenge for a young child anytime they're dealing with a symbolic object. And I think that part of what that happens with age is that children, first of all, they learn about symbols. So those babies learn about the nature of pictures. children also learn about the fact that a model might tell them something about something else. In addition, in all the cases, I think that inhibitory control, the growth of the ability to stop your initial reaction to something, is important. And finally, neurological maturation is certainly important, really, in all of these phenomena. So for my final slide, I just want to leave you with one further example of a dual representation error, of a confusion of symbol and referent, and that's this. So that's it. Thank you.